You and your mother get the 70 square foot storage room. My husband, who got stuck between a rock and a hard place living in my parents' home, had an outburst right after we finished renovating. My husband snapped. He started saying he would kick me and my mother out and live with his own mother in my parents' house, which was remodeled to look exactly like our new house. I was shaking with anger as I realized my parents' house, filled with memories of my late father, had been taken over. My name is Lisa Matthews, and I turned 33 this year. I've been married to my husband, Thomas, for 8 years. We both work and live with my mother at my parents' house. It's okay because our jobs are very close by. It was a sort of curveball situation, you know. My father passed away before I got married. I was hesitant to leave my mother alone to get married, but my husband said,
"If you're worried about leaving your mom alone, let's live together."
I was really happy when he agreed to live in the home my father built for us. Although it is an old home, it's a home filled with memories for my mother and I. My husband is the youngest of 3 brothers, and my mother-in-law seemed to have spoiled her eldest son a lot. My husband often complained about the vast difference in treatment between him and his eldest brother. Because of his lightweight position as the youngest child, he was able to make the decision to live at my parents' house. I made up my mind to marry him after hearing these words. However, there was one person who was against my husband living in my family home. It was my husband's mother, my mother-in-law. Perhaps she felt as if her own son had been stolen. The eldest son and his wife live in my husband's family home, so it would be difficult for us to live there, even if we wanted to. As we were saving for our own home, I convinced my mother-in-law that it would be best for us to start our married life at my parents' house without paying rent. Although I had heard that my mother-in-law had always favored her eldest son, she suddenly started to show concern for my husband around this time. I didn't think we'd have this much trouble over my husband moving out of his family home, but our relationship with my mother-in-law remained strained after our marriage because of this issue. Lately, my husband has become very concerned about his mother. It might be because she suddenly started to treat him with affection after our engagement was decided. Maybe he's happy to get attention from his mother, but my husband has started to prioritize her over everything. Above all, he also starts to get furious if I don't think of my mother-in-law first. I've never neglected my mother-in-law, and I've been trying to be nice to her. However, according to my husband, I am treating my own biological mother better than my mother-in-law. Of course, we don't talk about such things in front of my mother. When we were alone together, it had become a habit for him to whine and complain. Because my husband keeps telling me to pay more attention to my mother-in-law, I try to visit her house frequently, even though I always bring her favorite gifts and make sure to let her know before I go. She is often not at home. I could feel that she was obviously avoiding me, but I had no choice but to go because I knew that if I didn't, my mother-in-law would complain to my husband that I never visit or bring her anything. Every time my sister-in-law, the wife of the oldest brother, apologizes and hands over the gifts to my mother-in-law. She also seemed to be receiving a lot of criticism from our mother-in-law, and she said, "It's tough on both of us. We're the same age and we get along really well." I thought that my mother-in-law's attitude would soften as the years went by, even though things had been strained at first as newlyweds. But I was very wrong. Even after 8 years of marriage, her attitude has not changed at all. A lot has changed over the 8 years since we got married. My father-in-law passed away, and twins were born to the eldest son and his wife. There have been various changes in our family. The house of my in-laws is particularly lively now. The eldest son and his wife have many children, and with the recent birth of the twins, they now have 5 children. Moreover, all of them were boys. Because of the excessive liveliness, my mother-in-law seemed overwhelmed, and my husband asked me if we could take care of my mother-in-law in our house for a little while. Actually, my brother-in-law told my husband that his wife was having a hard time, and he wanted their mother to do some housework. But my brother-in-law's wife told me that our mother-in-law didn't want to do any of it, and could she stay at our house instead. Although we had an extra room, the house was terribly old. I proposed to my husband that if my mother-in-law was going to live with us temporarily, we might need to renovate the house. My husband seemed to think I would object to keeping my mother-in-law, and he looked surprised at my reaction. I wasn't really keen on the idea myself, but I agreed in hopes that my brother-in-law's wife would have a break. My husband works for a construction company, and renovations are his expertise. It can be sure that my husband will take care of everything. I'll leave it to you because you're the expert. I said so and decided to renovate this house. My mother is getting old, so it was a good opportunity to consider making the house accessible by removing the steps and installing the handrails. During the renovation, my mother and I stayed at my sister's house, and my husband stayed temporarily in a weekly rental apartment with my mother-in-law. But the incident happened on the day when the renovation was completed. Up to this point, I had believed that the house was being transformed into a comfortable home. I was looking around the house under my husband's guidance. There are no steps and handrails in various places, making it possible to live in the house for a long time, even when one gets old. My husband had cleverly made a hobby room for himself. I decided to accept it. Since he is a contributor to the renovation, let's at least give him credit for that. After being shown all the rooms, I suddenly realized there were no rooms for my mother and I. The room my mother used to use was now my mother-in-law's room. Where's Mom's room? You haven't shown it to me yet. I didn't care about my own room, but it was strange that there was no room for my mother.
I just showed you,
my husband said, laughing. I had a bad feeling about this. Huh? You haven't shown me yet.
You and your mom get the 70 square foot storage room,
my husband replied. I couldn't believe my ears. Indeed, I was shown the 70 square foot storage room earlier. It was the place in the house that received the least sunlight. A dark storage room with only a small window. Are you joking? Don't say stupid things, I retorted. My mother-in-law intervened between my husband and I. It's been 8 years since you became my daughter-in-law, but you still haven't learned how to behave as a wife. You're not qualified to be a wife if you're going to bite back at your husband. This house was beautifully rebuilt by Thomas. If you don't like that room, why don't you get a divorce and leave? She spat out. The word divorce suddenly flashed in front of me, and I lost my patience, my blood rushing to my head. Thinking that I wouldn't dare to divorce, my husband was laughing. At that moment, all the affection built up over 8 years of marriage flew away. I see. This was your plan from the beginning. If you don't like the 70 square foot storage room, why don't you put your mom in a facility? There's no room anyway. It must be hard for you to have 2 mothers under the same roof. I glared at my husband, who dared to say such a thing. Come to think of it, my brother-in-law's wife told me. Since the renovation was decided, my husband and mother-in-law were always stuck together and talking about something. My husband, having never indulged before, was now behaving like a child towards his mother, doting on her in front of my brother-in-law and his children. Ever since the renovation was decided, my mother-in-law was thrilled to have a new house and a quiet environment, and my husband was eagerly waiting to live with his beloved mother. Seeing the 2 of them attached at the hip and grinning, I started to feel sick. I took my stunned mother's arm and, making loud footsteps, walked out the front door. I deliberately stomped on the hallway as I walked, thinking at least it might do some damage. My mother followed me, bewildered, as we left our family home. The triumphant laughter of my husband and mother-in-law echoed from behind us. I couldn't forgive my husband's betrayal after living together as a couple for 8 years. All I could think about was getting revenge. When we finally returned to my sister's house, we were so overwhelmed we just collapsed. It was all too much to even put into words. My mother was still in shock. "Do you think they've taken over our house?" she muttered after taking a sip of the tea my sister had made. Her words were like a punch in the gut. This was the result of me agreeing to the renovation my husband suggested and leaving everything to him. "We have to reclaim our house, our home, filled with so many memories. The house that Dad built for us," she whispered. I squeezed her hand tightly. Half measures were not enough for me. "We can't just sit back and do nothing. We're going to fight this head on." My mother looked up at me. "What are we going to do?" "I have a plan." I revealed my plan to my mother. She looked a bit surprised, but nodded in agreement. "If it's your idea, Lisa, I won't oppose it." With that one sentence from my mother, our counterattack against my husband and mother-in-law began. A few days later, I saw a moving truck parked near our family home. From afar, I could see my mother-in-law directing my husband to bring in her belongings. Judging from the amount of luggage, it was clear that she intended to move in for good, not just temporarily. My mother-in-law didn't lift a finger, just gave instructions to my husband. He happily helped her with the move. Seeing his face made my anger towards them grow even more. After checking the situation at my family home, I visited our lawyer with a real estate agent. I thought it was the only way to counter my husband's betrayal. I explained to the lawyer everything that had happened after the renovation and how my husband and mother-in-law had taken over our house. At first, he was shocked, but after hearing about my husband's terrible behavior, he shared our anger. And so we were able to secure the full cooperation of both the lawyer and the real estate agent. A week after my husband and mother-in-law had taken over my family home, I visited again. When I rang the doorbell, my cheerful mother-in-law appeared. "Hello, who's there?" "Oh, it's you." Her face soured as soon as she saw me. "I have something important to discuss today. I'm coming in." "Oh, I'm sorry. You're acting as if you were the owner of this house. It's easy to forget that it's actually my house," I said sarcastically and walked straight into the house. The house, having been renovated and filled with new furniture and appliances, was no longer the family home I remembered. It felt as if my childhood memories had been completely wiped away. My husband was relaxing in the living room at the back. Like my mother-in-law, he looked displeased at the sight of me and said, "What's up with you barging into people's houses like that?" "You. Long time no see. I have something important to discuss today." I had my lawyer present as well, and I faced my husband across the table. "What's up? You decided to live in a tiny studio apartment? Got a mover for just one guy? Not much stuff you can fit in a studio apartment, huh?" He mocked. I was pissed off at my husband's attitude, but I had decided to remain calm today. No matter what, I was bound to win this. There was no need to rush anything. Before jumping to conclusions, there's something I want to ask you. Why had he renovated my family home into such a state and driven us out? I wanted to confirm his true intentions. I thought we had been living as a happily married couple with no major disputes since our marriage. I was sure his relationship with my mother was also good. I don't understand why my husband's attitude changed so drastically. Even if he was instigated by my mother-in-law, what he did was too bold. At my question, my husband let out a big sigh as if it were troublesome. Then he showed a sneering smile again. "I got tired of it all. Living like a dutiful husband, being considerate to you and your mother. I've been patient for a long time. I want to live with my mother. I don't need anything else." I was taken aback at my husband, who half shouted. I was speechless at the realization that he was just a mama's boy. Unable to say anything, I listened to my husband start to spill all the frustrations he had been holding back. He was frustrated that he couldn't live with his mother and embarrassed that as a man he was living in his wife's house. It felt like I had been deceived. He endured it all on his own, got angry on his own, and even plotted to take over my family home. I began to suspect he might be a psychopath. If you have that much dissatisfaction, you should have just told me.
How can I possibly express dissatisfaction? I'm a man. You should understand.
Even his final assertion was utterly ridiculous. My mother-in-law was teary-eyed as she listened to my husband's argument. I thought that this was the result of her nurturing her eldest son with excessive affection, but it didn't seem like she thought so. She just seemed to pity her son, who adored her. Being subjected to this cheap soap opera, I sighed heavily, unable to bear the ridiculousness. It seemed that my husband was offended by my attitude and raised his voice.
What's with that attitude? You should be grateful that I even prepared a small studio room for you. I could have taken away your room too.
With his face turned red, my husband looked like a tantrum-throwing child. That's right. Keep a room for a useless daughter-in-law. What a kind son you are.
I'm happy to be praised by you.
To quickly end this farce, I presented my husband with the divorce papers. Of course, already signed by me. Please divorce me. I don't want to stay married after being treated like this. Then I showed him the registration of the house, explaining that it was one of the properties I had inherited from my father and it was under my name. Looking at the documents, my husband seemed to realize something.
I won't divorce. I did the renovation. Even if the property is under your name, it should be considered as both of ours. I will absolutely not divorce.
It seemed my husband realized that if we divorced, he would be kicked out of this house. Even if you don't want to divorce, what made you think you could stay here? The house is in my name. It's my property, so I've sold it. I spread out another document before my husband, a sales contract for the land and house. Both he and my mother-in-law leaned in to check the names and dates on the paper. Since this house is already sold, you'll need to move out promptly. We have potential buyers, so you should leave by today or tomorrow. With a smile, I told the two of them. Their faces turned pale. Whether you divorce or not, you cannot live in this house. I don't want to see your faces anymore, so I want you to divorce. Hold on. Why? Wasn't this your house? My mother-in-law had mistakenly thought that the house belonged to my husband. He probably hadn't expected me to take such drastic measures. He seemed to have assumed that I would accept some kind of compromise and forgive him. But I'm not that naive, and my love for my husband has cooled. I don't have a shred of mercy left. Please discuss the details with my lawyer. Don't come directly to me. If we are kicked out of this house, where will we? Yeah, we thought we finally found a place where we could peacefully spend our retirement, and a maid. My mother-in-law seemed to have thought of my mother and me as maids rather than family. Feeling it wasn't good for my mental health to talk to these people anymore, I suggested, why don't you go back to your family home and live with your eldest son and his wife? Oh, but since you made such a fuss about leaving, your older brother might be angry and not let you in. Leaving those words behind, I quickly left my family home. My family home filled with so many memories. I hesitated to sell it. But after being so disrespected, I couldn't back down. The truth is, my childhood home had already drastically changed. I don't think my decision was wrong. 3 days later, my husband and mother-in-law hastily left my family home. I didn't want to keep the house after it had been remodeled so recklessly, so I had it demolished and put the land up for sale. Looking at the empty plot where nothing was left, I felt a mix of emptiness, relief, and a complicated array of other emotions. After that, my husband and mother-in-law moved back to their family home for a while, seemingly treated as nuisances by my older brother and his wife. My husband, who had been reluctant to divorce until the end, seemed to have realized my feelings had completely cooled when I left all negotiations to my lawyer. My lawyer said he signed the divorce papers while crying at the end. Eventually, my husband seemed to be despairing of his mother, who had started to flatter my older brother more than him. Just when he thought he had finally become his mother's number one, it turned out to be a short-lived victory. It seems that my mother-in-law was ultimately disowned by my older brother and his wife. My husband and mother-in-law started living together in a small apartment near their workplace. My husband, who had never really lived alone, seemed to be struggling, and my mother-in-law, despite complaining about her son's low earnings, had to do all the housework again, complaining every day. My husband contacts me almost every week, asking for reconciliation because living with my mother-in-law is too hard, but I ignore all his messages. Even after everything that happened, my husband, who still thinks we can reconcile, is really a fool. I have no intention of remarrying, and I've built a small new house on the small plot of land left by my father, where I live with my mother. It's a small, single-story house because it's just the two of us, but it's filled with things that my mother and I love. I'm still working, so I have no financial worries. My mother, who was shocked by the loss of our old home, is gradually regaining her energy. Even though we're now strangers, my sister-in-law from my older brother's family brings her children over to play at our new house. She treats us the same after the divorce, and I'm truly grateful. Our new life with my mother has just begun. My mother and I laughed, promising to enjoy whatever comes next.